The grand ballroom of the Geneva International Conference Center buzzed with anticipation as world leaders gathered for what many considered the most crucial diplomatic summit of the decade. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over delegates from 63 nations, their conversations creating a symphony of languages and political ambitions. The air itself seemed thick with the weight of decisions that could reshape global alliances. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's seasoned prime minister, moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man who had navigated these waters for decades. His tailored navy suit spoke of authority, while his calculated handshakes and measured smiles revealed years of diplomatic training. He had arrived in Geneva with a clear agenda to secure Israel's position in the rapidly changing Middle Eastern landscape and establish new partnerships that would guarantee his nation's future prosperity. At the opposite end of the room stood Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's young leader who had captured international attention with his bold speeches about African sovereignty. Unlike the polished veterans surrounding him, Traoré carried himself with raw authenticity. His simple black suit contrasted sharply with the ornate uniforms and expensive fabrics worn by other delegates. Yet there was something magnetic about his presence that drew conversations to a halt when he spoke. The summit had been organized to address global economic partnerships, climate change initiatives, and security cooperation. However, beneath the formal agenda lay deeper currents of tension. Developing nations were increasingly vocal about their desire to break free from traditional power structures, while established powers sought to maintain their influence through new forms of cooperation. Netanyahu had spent the morning in private meetings with European leaders, discussing trade agreements and security partnerships. His approach was methodical, each conversation building toward his larger vision of Israel as an indispensable bridge between the developed world and emerging markets. He spoke eloquently about technological innovation, military expertise, and economic opportunities that could benefit all parties involved. Meanwhile, Traoré had been engaging with African Union representatives and leaders from other developing nations. His conversations centered on themes of self-determination, resource sovereignty, and the need for authentic partnerships rather than neo-colonial relationships disguised as cooperation. His words carried the passion of someone who had witnessed firsthand the exploitation of his continent's resources and people. As the formal sessions began, the contrast between these two approaches became evident. Netanyahu's presentations were polished PowerPoint displays featuring economic projections, technological achievements, and strategic assessments. He spoke of futures that could be built through careful planning and mutual benefit, always positioning Israel as an essential partner in achieving these goals. Traoré's contributions were different entirely. He spoke without notes, his words flowing from deep conviction rather than prepared talking points. He challenged assumptions, questioned established frameworks, and consistently returned to fundamental questions about who truly benefits from international cooperation. His interventions were brief but memorable, often leaving other delegates reconsidering their own positions. The tension in the room was palpable as these different worldviews collided. Traditional allies found themselves defending policies they had taken for granted, while emerging leaders pushed for conversations about justice, equality, and genuine partnership. The moderators struggled to maintain diplomatic decorum as debates became increasingly heated. As the day progressed, Netanyahu began to sense that his usual diplomatic strategies were meeting unexpected resistance. The young African leaders were not impressed by Israel's technological achievements or strategic importance. They asked difficult questions about Palestine, about arms sales to repressive regimes, about the true cost of the partnerships being offered. Traoré remained largely quiet during these exchanges, but his presence was felt throughout the room. Other African delegates frequently glanced in his direction, seeking nonverbal cues about how to respond to various proposals. It became clear that despite his youth and his nation's small size, Traoré wielded significant influence among the developing world representatives. The first day concluded with polite applause and carefully worded statements about productive dialogue. However, the real conversations were happening in hotel lobbies, restaurant corners, and private meeting rooms. Alliance lines were being drawn, and both Netanyahu and Traoré were central figures in these behind-the-scenes negotiations. That evening, as delegates retreated to their accommodations, the stage was set for what would become one of the summit's most memorable confrontations. Netanyahu had scheduled a major address for the following day, one he believed would establish the framework for future global cooperation. Traoré, meanwhile, was preparing his own response to what he saw as continued attempts to maintain unjust power structures under the guise of partnership. Neither man fully understood how dramatically their exchange would capture global attention, nor how their words would resonate far beyond the conference room walls. The collision of their worldviews was about to create ripples that would influence international relations for years to come, challenging long-held assumptions about leadership, sovereignty, and the true meaning of partnership in an interconnected world. Morning light filtered through the conference center's massive windows as delegates filed into the main auditorium for what was billed as the summit's keynote address. Netanyahu had requested this speaking slot weeks in advance, and the organizers had granted it, expecting his usual blend of diplomatic sophistication and strategic insight. The Israeli delegation occupied the front row, their confidence evident in their relaxed postures and quiet conversations. Netanyahu approached the podium with the measured pace of someone accustomed to commanding attention. The microphone adjustment, the brief pause to survey his audience, the opening smile. Everything was choreographed with the precision of decades in the spotlight. Behind him, a large screen displayed the Israeli flag alongside the summit's official logo, creating a visual reminder of his nation's presence on the global stage. "Distinguished colleagues, fellow leaders, friends," he began, his voice carrying easily through the sound system. "We gather here today not merely as representatives of our individual nations, but as architects of tomorrow. The decisions we make in these halls will determine whether our children inherit a world of prosperity and security or one of chaos and decline." The opening was classic Netanyahu, broad, inspiring, yet tinged with an undertone of urgency that suggested only certain paths led to success. He spoke of technological revolutions that were reshaping warfare, economics, and governance. He painted pictures of smart cities powered by artificial intelligence, of agricultural innovations that could feed growing populations, of defense systems that could protect democratic values against authoritarian threats. Israel stands ready to share these innovations with partners who understand the complexity of our modern world, he continued, clicking to slides showing impressive statistics about Israeli startups, military technologies, and economic growth. But partnership requires commitment. It requires understanding that some nations have developed the expertise and infrastructure necessary to lead this transformation. As he spoke, Traoré sat in the third row, his expression unreadable. Unlike other delegates who took notes or whispered to advisors, he remained perfectly still, his attention focused entirely on Netanyahu's words. Several journalists had noticed his posture and were occasionally capturing shots of his stoic observation. Netanyahu's presentation built methodically toward his central thesis. He spoke of the need for mature partnerships between established democracies and emerging nations. He outlined frameworks for technology transfer, security cooperation, and economic development that would, he argued, lift all participants toward prosperity and stability. "The future belongs to those who can navigate complexity," he declared, his voice rising slightly for emphasis. "It belongs to nations that understand the delicate balance between innovation and tradition, between security and openness, between national interests and global cooperation. This is not a future that can be achieved through rhetoric or wishful thinking. It requires proven leadership, tested institutions, and the wisdom that comes from decades of navigating international challenges. The applause was polite but not enthusiastic. Many delegates recognized the skill of Netanyahu's presentation while simultaneously feeling uncomfortable with its underlying assumptions. The African Union representatives shifted in their seats while several Latin American delegates exchanged meaningful glances. Netanyahu seemed to sense the mixed reception but pressed forward. "Let me be clear about what I am proposing," he said, advancing to his final slides. "The challenges of the 21st century, climate change, terrorism, economic instability, technological disruption, these require solutions that have been tested under pressure. They require partnerships with nations that have demonstrated their ability to survive and thrive despite constant threats." The implication was unmistakable. Israel, having survived multiple wars, economic pressures, and security challenges, had earned the right to lead these partnerships. Other nations could participate, could benefit, could contribute, but the fundamental direction would come from those who had already proven their capabilities. "This is our moment," Netanyahu concluded, his hands gripping the podium edges. "This is our opportunity to build a future based on proven principles, tested alliances, and the hard-earned wisdom of nations that have faced existential challenges and emerged stronger. The future is not guaranteed to anyone, but it belongs to those who understand how to secure it." The applause that followed was more substantial, particularly from the European and North American delegations. However, a distinct chill had settled over the developing world representatives. Netanyahu's vision, however eloquently presented, positioned them as junior partners in their own development, beneficiaries of wisdom and technology controlled by others. As Netanyahu returned to his seat, accepting congratulations from nearby allies, Traoré remained motionless. His delegation had expected him to take notes, to prepare a formal response, to engage in the diplomatic theater that these occasions demanded. Instead, he sat in contemplative silence, processing not just Netanyahu's words, but the underlying assumptions that made such a speech possible. The morning session continued with responses from other leaders, most offering qualified support for increased cooperation while carefully avoiding direct endorsement of Netanyahu's hierarchical vision. The European Union representative spoke of mutual benefit and shared responsibility. The Canadian Prime Minister emphasized inclusive partnerships that respect all participants' sovereignty. But everyone in the room sensed that the real response would come from the developing world and specifically from the young African leader who had remained conspicuously silent throughout the morning's proceedings. As the session broke for lunch, whispers circulated about when Traoré would speak and what he might say in response to Netanyahu's bold claim about controlling the future. The stage was set for a confrontation between two radically different visions of international cooperation, between established power seeking to maintain its influence and emerging leadership demanding fundamental change. Neither man had yet realized how completely their exchange would capture global attention, nor how their different approaches to partnership would resonate far beyond the conference room walls. The afternoon session began with a restless energy that had not been present in the morning. Word had spread during lunch that Traoré had requested speaking time, and delegates returned to their seats with the anticipation of witnesses preparing to observe a significant moment. The press gallery, which had been half empty earlier, was now packed with journalists from international media outlets who sensed that something important was about to unfold. Netanyahu sat with his delegation, reviewing notes and occasionally glancing toward the Burkina Faso section. His morning presentation had been well received by traditional allies, and several European leaders had approached him during the break to discuss implementation details of his proposed partnerships. Yet he could feel the tension in the room, the sense that his vision would not go unchallenged. Traoré had spent the lunch break in quiet conversation with other African leaders, not strategizing or rehearsing, but simply listening to their concerns about the morning's presentations. His advisor had prepared talking points and suggested diplomatic language that would allow him to disagree without causing offense. But Traoré had set those notes aside, choosing instead to trust his instincts about what needed to be said. When his name was called, Traoré rose slowly from his seat and walked to the podium without fanfare. Unlike Netanyahu's confident stride, Traoré moved with quiet purpose, neither hurried nor hesitant. He carried no papers, no slides, no technological aids. At the microphone, he paused for a moment, not to gather himself but to look directly at the faces of his fellow delegates. "This morning, we heard a vision of the future," he began, his voice calm but carrying clearly through the auditorium. "We heard about partnerships and cooperation, about proven leadership and tested institutions. We heard about who deserves to control tomorrow based on their success in controlling yesterday." The room fell completely silent. Even the rustling of papers ceased as delegates sensed they were about to witness something unprecedented. Netanyahu leaned forward slightly, his expression alert but not yet concerned. "I listened carefully to these words," Traoré continued, "and I found myself thinking about my grandfather." This unexpected personal reference caused several journalists to look up from their notes. "My grandfather lived through colonial rule in Burkina Faso. He was told repeatedly about partnerships and cooperation, about how foreign expertise would lift our people toward prosperity and stability." Traoré's tone remained conversational, almost gentle, but his words began to carry an edge that cut through the diplomatic politeness. These partners had proven institutions. They had tested military capabilities. They had the wisdom that comes from conquering and controlling other nations. And they promised to share this wisdom with us, to guide us toward a future they would design. The parallel to Netanyahu's morning presentation was becoming clear, and discomfort rippled through the room. Several delegates shifted in their seats, while others maintained careful poker faces. Netanyahu's expression had hardened slightly, though he maintained his diplomatic composure. "My grandfather learned many things during those years," Traoré said, his voice gaining strength. "He learned that partnerships often mean one party provides the labor and resources while the other provides the direction and takes the profits. He learned that proven leadership sometimes means the ability to convince others that their own interests align with your control over them." The African Union delegates were now sitting straighter in their chairs, while several European representatives looked increasingly uncomfortable. The Canadian Prime Minister was taking notes, but her expression suggested she was thinking beyond mere diplomatic recording. "Today I heard familiar language about mature partnerships and tested institutions. I heard about nations that have earned the right to lead because they have survived challenges and emerged stronger. And I wondered, stronger than whom? Stronger than the nations they dominated? Stronger than the peoples they displaced? Stronger than the resources they extracted?" Traoré paused, allowing his questions to settle over the audience. When he continued, his voice carried a new intensity that commanded absolute attention. "We are told that the future belongs to those who understand complexity, who can navigate the delicate balance between competing interests. But what if that complexity is artificial? What if those balances exist only because some nations insist on maintaining control over others?" Netanyahu was now taking notes himself, though whether for diplomatic purposes or personal reflection was unclear. His delegation was watching their leader carefully, waiting for cues about how to respond to this unexpected challenge. "I want to be very clear about something," Traoré said, his gaze sweeping across the entire assembly. "When we speak of the future, whose future are we discussing? When we talk about partnerships, who is the senior partner and who provides the raw materials? When we celebrate proven leadership, are we celebrating the ability to lead or the power to compel others to follow?" The questions hung in the air like a direct challenge, not just to Netanyahu's presentation, but to the entire framework within which international cooperation was typically discussed. Several delegates were now whispering to their advisors, while others sat in contemplative silence. "Because here is what I believe," Traoré continued, building toward what everyone sensed would be his crucial point. "The future does not belong to any single nation or group of nations. It cannot be controlled, managed, or directed by those who claim expertise based on past domination. The future belongs to all of us, or it belongs to none of us." The room was electric with tension now. This was far beyond typical diplomatic disagreement. This was a fundamental challenge to the power structures that governed international relations. Netanyahu's hands were clasped tightly in front of him, his mind clearly working through the implications of Traoré's words and preparing his response. But Traoré was not finished. He had one more point to make, one more challenge to deliver, that would crystallize their disagreement and capture the attention of the world beyond the conference room walls. The silence in the auditorium had become profound, the kind of quiet that precedes moments that change everything. Traoré stood at the podium with the stillness of someone who understood the weight of what he was about to say. Every camera in the press gallery was focused on him. Every delegate leaned forward in anticipation, and Netanyahu sat rigid in his chair, waiting for the challenge he could sense coming. "This morning," Traoré said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper that somehow commanded even greater attention, "we were told that the future belongs to those who can control it. We were presented with a vision where proven nations guide emerging ones, where tested institutions direct newer experiments in democracy, where wisdom earned through conflict grants the right to determine the path forward for others." He paused, his eyes finding Netanyahu's across the crowded room. The moment of direct eye contact lasted only seconds, but everyone present felt its significance. This was no longer about abstract policy differences. This had become personal, immediate, and unavoidable. "But I must ask a fundamental question," Traoré continued, his voice now rising with controlled passion. "Who granted this authority? When did survival become the same as wisdom? When did military strength become equivalent to moral leadership? When did the ability to dominate others translate into the right to determine their future?" Netanyahu's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His decades of diplomatic training had prepared him for many forms of challenge, but Traoré's approach was unlike anything he had encountered. This was not the careful dance of traditional diplomacy, where disagreements were wrapped in layers of courtesy and procedural language. This was direct, unflinching, and absolutely clear in its implications. "We have been told that complexity requires proven leadership," Traoré said, building toward his climactic point. "We have been told that the challenges of our time demand the guidance of nations that have demonstrated their ability to survive and prosper. We have been told, in essence, that the future belongs to those who have the power to claim it." The African Union section was completely focused on their young colleague, while other developing nation delegates nodded almost unconsciously. Even some European representatives were beginning to shift uncomfortably as Traoré's logic built toward its inevitable conclusion. "But today, I want to offer a different vision," Traoré declared, his voice now carrying throughout the room with clarity and force. "I want to suggest that true partnership means equal voices in determining direction. I want to propose that wisdom comes not from the ability to dominate, but from the courage to cooperate as equals. I want to argue that the future belongs to all of us together, or it belongs to none of us." Netanyahu could contain himself no longer. Rising from his seat without waiting for formal recognition, he approached the microphone as Traoré stepped aside. The breach of protocol sent a ripple of surprise through the assembly, but no one moved to enforce procedural rules. Everyone understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. "With respect to my colleague from Burkina Faso," Netanyahu began, his voice carrying the authority of years in power, "idealism is a luxury that history does not always afford. The future is not a matter of wishful thinking or noble intentions. The future is earned through hard choices, difficult sacrifices, and the wisdom that comes from facing existential threats. His words carried the weight of a man who had spent his life navigating real dangers, making life and death decisions, and bearing responsibility for his nation's survival. Israel has faced annihilation multiple times. We have built prosperity in a hostile region. We have created democracy under siege. This experience has value, and that value translates into leadership. Traoré remained standing near the podium, listening intently but showing no sign of backing down. When Netanyahu paused, he stepped back to the microphone without hesitation. No one questions Israel's achievements or the challenges your nation has faced. Traoré replied, his tone respectful but unwavering. But survival does not grant dominion over others. Success does not create the right to determine the future for nations that have walked different paths. The exchange was now direct, immediate, and impossible to ignore. Delegates sat transfixed as these two leaders engaged in a confrontation that stripped away diplomatic niceties and exposed fundamental disagreements about power, partnership, and the right to determine global direction. "You speak of equal partnership," Netanyahu responded, his voice growing sharper. "But equality requires equal capability, equal contribution, equal responsibility. The future cannot be left to chance or to the good intentions of nations that have not proven their ability to navigate complexity." It was this statement that triggered Traoré's most powerful response. His eyes flashed with something that went beyond diplomatic disagreement into the realm of moral outrage, though his voice remained controlled and precise. "Mr. Prime Minister," Traoré said, each word carefully measured, "you have just articulated perfectly the thinking that has justified centuries of domination. You have just explained why some nations believe they have the right to control others. You have just claimed ownership of the future based on your assessment of who deserves to shape it." The room held its collective breath as Traoré prepared to deliver the words that would define this moment and capture headlines around the world. His next statement would crystallize their disagreement in a way that could not be ignored, forgotten, or diplomatically smoothed over. Time seemed suspended in the conference hall as Traoré stood at the microphone, the weight of his next words hanging in the air like electricity before a storm. Netanyahu remained positioned near the podium, his expression alert and challenging, while every delegate in the room leaned forward in anticipation. The press gallery was completely still, cameras focused, recording equipment running, everyone sensing they were about to witness a moment that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. Traoré's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a quiet intensity that made his words more powerful than any shouting could have achieved. "Mr. Prime Minister," he said, looking directly at Netanyahu, "you have spoken eloquently about controlling the future. You have outlined your vision of partnerships where proven nations guide emerging ones, where tested institutions direct newer, experiments in democracy, where military strength and survival grant the authority to determine global direction." He paused, allowing the recap to settle, then continued with devastating precision. "But you have made a fundamental error in your calculations. You have confused the ability to survive with the right to dominate. You have mistaken military success for moral authority, and most importantly, you have claimed ownership of something that belongs to all humanity." Netanyahu's hands were clasped tightly behind his back, his diplomatic training warring with a clear desire to interrupt. But Traoré's momentum was building, and the room's attention was completely focused on the young African leader who was systematically dismantling the foundations of traditional power politics. "When you speak of the future," Traoré said, emphasizing the words with careful deliberation, "you speak as though it is a resource to be managed, a territory to be controlled, a prize to be awarded to the victor. But the future is not yours to give or withhold. It is not a commodity that can be purchased with military strength or technological advancement. The African Union delegates were now sitting straighter, while several Latin American representatives nodded almost unconsciously. Even some European delegates appeared to be reconsidering assumptions they had taken for granted throughout their careers. Traoré stepped closer to the microphone, his voice dropping to a level that somehow commanded even greater attention. "You have told us that the future belongs to those who understand complexity, who can navigate the delicate balance between competing interests. But what you have really said is that the future belongs to you, to nations like yours, to those who have already claimed the right to determine the direction of global development." Netanyahu could no longer remain silent. "The future belongs to those who can secure it," he interjected, his voice carrying across the room without amplification. "To those who can protect democratic values, promote stability, and ensure prosperity. This is not about domination, it is about responsibility." But Traoré was ready for this response. Without missing a beat, he delivered the words that would become the defining moment of the entire summit. The phrase that would be quoted in newspapers, analyzed by political commentators, and remembered as the moment when traditional power structures faced their most direct challenge. "Mr. Prime Minister," Traoré said, his voice now carrying the full force of his conviction, "you keep saying the future as though it belongs to you. But let me be absolutely clear about something that seems to have escaped your understanding." The room fell into complete silence. Even the sound technicians seemed to hold their breath as Traoré prepared to deliver his knockout blow. "When you claim control of the future," Traoré declared, his words ringing through the auditorium with unmistakable clarity and power, "you need to remember something fundamental. It's not your future you're talking about. The future belongs to all of us, and we will not allow you or any nation to claim ownership of what belongs to humanity as a whole." The impact of these words was immediate and electric. Delegates throughout the room straightened in their seats, while others began, whispering urgently to their advisors. The press gallery erupted in quiet activity as journalists recognized they had just witnessed a moment of genuine historical significance. But Traoré was not finished. Having delivered his central message, he pressed forward with the implications that made his challenge so powerful and so threatening to established order. "This is not our future that you seek to control," he continued, his voice now carrying to every corner of the room. "This is not your blueprint that the world must follow. This is not your vision that other nations must accept as the price of partnership." Netanyahu's face had flushed slightly, his diplomatic composure strained by the directness of the attack. Around the room, traditional allies of Israel were shifting uncomfortably, while developing nations watched with growing excitement and approval. "The future we build will be built together, as equals, with equal voices and equal authority over the decisions that affect us all," Traoré declared. "It will not be handed down from those who believe their survival grants them sovereignty over others. It will not be designed by nations that mistake their military capabilities for moral leadership." The young leader paused, allowing his words to resonate throughout the assembly, then delivered his final devastating point. "And most importantly, it will not be controlled by anyone who confuses the power to dominate with the right to determine destiny for the rest of humanity." The silence that followed was profound and charged with tension. Netanyahu stood motionless, clearly struggling between diplomatic protocol and personal outrage. Traoré remained at the podium, his message delivered with precision and power that left no room for misinterpretation. The confrontation had reached its peak, but the implications were only beginning to unfold. Around the world, news outlets were already preparing headlines about the young African leader who had dared to challenge one of international politics' most seasoned practitioners, and the phrase "not our future" was beginning to spread across social media platforms and news reports. The aftermath of Traoré's powerful response created an atmosphere in the conference hall that no one present would ever forget. The silence that followed his words was not the polite quiet of diplomatic consideration, but the stunned hush that accompanies moments when fundamental assumptions are shattered publicly and irreversibly. Netanyahu stood frozen at his position near the podium, his decades of political experience offering no guidance for how to respond to such a direct and devastating challenge. The press gallery had erupted into controlled chaos as journalists recognized they had witnessed something unprecedented. Phones buzzed with urgent messages as editors around the world demanded immediate coverage of what was already being called the most significant diplomatic confrontation of the decade. The phrase, "not our future," was spreading across social media platforms at lightning speed, accompanied by video clips that captured the intensity of Traoré's delivery and Netanyahu's shocked reaction. Other delegates in the assembly seemed uncertain how to respond to the breach of diplomatic protocol, but the power of Traoré's message was undeniable. The African Union section had broken into quiet applause, quickly joined by representatives from several Latin American and Asian nations. European delegates maintained careful neutrality, their expressions revealing the complexity of their position. As traditional allies of Israel, who could not entirely dismiss the moral force of Traoré's arguments, Netanyahu finally found his voice, though it carried a strain that revealed how deeply Traoré's words had affected him. "The future requires leadership," he said, his tone now defensive rather than authoritative. "It requires nations that can make difficult decisions, that can bear responsibility for consequences, that can navigate the complexities of international relations without naive idealism." But his words fell flat in the charged atmosphere. Traoré had shifted the entire framework of the conversation, making Netanyahu's responses sound like justifications for a system that the young African leader had just exposed as fundamentally unjust. The Israeli Prime Minister's usual confidence had been replaced by the awkward position of defending assumptions that had previously gone unchallenged. Traoré stepped back to the microphone one final time, his voice now carrying the quiet authority of someone who had fundamentally altered the conversation. "Mr. Prime Minister, you speak of leadership and responsibility, but true leadership means recognizing when systems must change. True responsibility means acknowledging that the wisdom to guide humanity's future cannot be concentrated in the hands of a few nations, no matter how proven their military capabilities or tested their institutions." The moderator finally intervened, recognizing that the exchange had moved beyond the bounds of typical diplomatic discourse and needed to be concluded before it escalated further. But the damage to traditional power structures had already been done. Traoré's challenge had been delivered with such clarity and force that it could not be ignored, dismissed, or diplomatically smoothed over. As the session broke for recess, delegates clustered in urgent conversations throughout the hall. The developing world representatives were energized and excited, recognizing that one of their own had articulated frustrations and aspirations they had felt but never expressed so directly. Traditional powers huddled with their advisors, trying to assess the implications of what they had witnessed and develop strategies for responding to this unexpected challenge to their authority. Within hours, news of the exchange had spread far beyond the conference center. International media outlets led their broadcasts with footage of Traoré's passionate response and Netanyahu's stunned reaction. The phrase, "not our future," became a trending hashtag across multiple languages, with social media users sharing clips of the confrontation and adding their own commentary about power, partnership, and the right to determine global direction. In African capitals, the response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Protesters in Ouagadougou filled the streets in support of their young leader, while government officials across the continent issued statements praising Traoré's courage in challenging established power structures. The African Union called an emergency session to discuss how to build on the momentum created by what media outlets were already calling the Geneva moment. European reactions were more complex and divided. Progressive politicians praised Traoré's moral clarity while expressing concern about the implications for existing international frameworks. Conservative voices defended Netanyahu's position while acknowledging the power of Traoré's challenge. The European Union issued a carefully worded statement about the importance of inclusive dialogue that satisfied no one but offended no one. In Israel, the response was predictably hostile. Government officials dismissed Traoré as an inexperienced leader seeking attention through inflammatory rhetoric. Israeli media characterized the exchange as an unfair attack on their nation's legitimate security concerns and international contributions. However, even within Israel, some voices began questioning whether Netanyahu's approach had been strategically wise, given the global reaction it had provoked. The confrontation's impact extended far beyond immediate political reactions. Universities around the world organized seminars to analyze the exchange and its implications for international relations theory. Think tanks produced papers examining whether traditional models of global leadership could survive challenges like Traoré's. Young activists in dozens of countries adopted "Not Our Future" as a rallying cry for various causes related to self-determination and resistance to imposed authority. Perhaps most significantly, the exchange had demonstrated that the old rules of diplomatic engagement were changing. Traoré had shown that moral authority could challenge military power, that passionate conviction could overcome polished presentation, and that direct confrontation could be more effective than careful negotiation. His approach inspired other leaders from developing nations to speak more boldly about their own concerns and aspirations. As the summit continued over the following days, the dynamic in the conference hall had fundamentally shifted. Netanyahu's remaining presentations were met with polite but cool reception, while Traoré found himself at the center of a growing coalition of nations demanding more equitable partnerships and genuine shared authority over global decision-making. The Geneva moment would be remembered as the point when post-colonial power structures faced their most direct and effective challenge in decades. Traoré's words had crystallized frustrations that had been building throughout the developing world, while Netanyahu's response had inadvertently revealed the assumptions that made such frustrations inevitable. Years later, diplomatic historians would mark this exchange as a turning point in international relations. The moment when a young African leader's moral clarity shattered the comfortable assumptions of established powers and forced the world to confront fundamental questions about who has the right to determine humanity's future. The phrase, "not our future," would echo through subsequent negotiations, treaties, and conflicts as a reminder that true partnership requires genuine equality and that the future belongs to all humanity or to none of it.